There are places in this country that don't show up wrong on a map. They look like every other stretch of road, every other line of trees, every other bend in a river that nobody bothers to name anymore. You could drive through them 100 times and never once feel like something was off. And then one night, you stop. Maybe your car makes a sound it hasn't made before. Maybe you check your phone and realize you haven't had signal for the last 40 minutes without noticing. Maybe you step outside just to stretch your legs, and the air hits you in a way that stops you mid-movement. Not cold, not warm, just wrong. My name is Cole Maddox. I take strange jobs. Officially, I'm a contractor. I handle wildlife threats, environmental hazards, and recovery work in areas where standard teams either won't go or have already gone and come back with nothing useful. I fill the gap between what's explainable and what isn't, between the report that gets filed and the report that gets buried. Unofficially, I get called when something doesn't fit a category, when the damage at a scene doesn't match the animal they're blaming it on, when 3 different witnesses report 3 completely different things in the same location at the same time, and every single one of them sounds wrong in a way that can't be faked. That's my work. That's been my work for a long time. I've covered 12 states before I ever took a contract in New York. Forests in the Pacific Northwest, where the undergrowth moves in ways that don't match the wind. Desert roads in the Southwest, where vehicles stop working in stretches that have no metallic interference and no geological explanation. Isolated towns in the Deep South, where missing persons cases get quietly reclassified as runaways or accidents, not because the evidence supports it, but because nothing else fits inside a form that has to be submitted to a county office. I've learned to recognize patterns in all of those places. Not the patterns they teach you in tracking courses or environmental science programs. Not the kind of patterns you can publish in a report and hand to a supervisor without getting looked at sideways for the rest of your career. I mean the other kind of patterns. The kind that only appear after enough time in the field, after enough contact with things that don't have official names, after enough nights where you made decisions based on instinct rather than procedure, and the instinct turned out to be the only reason you were still breathing when the sun came up. Those are the patterns that matter. The first case that brought me into the Hudson Valley looked simple on paper. A man had gone missing near a service road, one of those forgotten connector roads that cuts between a river town and a stretch of dense woodland that hadn't been properly maintained in years. His truck was found intact, keys still in the ignition, no signs of forced entry, no mechanical failure. The engine had been shut off cleanly, like he'd parked deliberately rather than broken down. Search teams had already been through the area twice before I arrived. Both times, they came back with nothing that lined up with a normal disappearance. No trail, no blood, no disturbed ground in any direction that would suggest a route he could have taken on foot. The dogs lost the scent approximately 30 feet from the truck and refused to push further. Not the kind of refusal where they get confused and circle. The kind where they plant themselves and won't move no matter what their handlers do. Experienced search and rescue dogs don't do that for nothing. But it was the witness reports that made me stop treating this like a standard missing persons assist. The first set of reports came from a hiking group, 4 people who had been on a trail about a mile northeast of where the truck was found. They described something large moving through the trees at dusk. Not an animal they couldn't identify. Not a bear acting strangely. Not a deer startled by their presence. Something tall. Something moving through the canopy level without slowing down, breaking branches at a height that put it well above what any known animal in that region could reach while staying on the ground. They described deep impressions in the earth beneath where it moved, not paw prints, not boot prints. Something that suggested extreme weight distributed across a narrow contact point, like something enormous pressing down through a surface smaller than it should have been. They took photos. The photos showed broken branches and disturbed soil. They did not show what made it. The second report came from a man staying at a roadside motel about 10 miles south of where the truck was found. He reported a dog standing outside his room, late at night, past 2 in the morning, just standing there on the parking lot asphalt, facing his door. Now, stray dogs near roadside motels are not unusual. What he described was unusual. He said the animal's posture was wrong, that it wasn't standing the way a dog stands when it's lost or hungry or curious. It was standing the way a person stands when they're waiting for something. Upright, deliberate, still in a way that felt considered rather than frozen. And its face. He struggled to describe what he saw when the animal turned toward him. He used the word expression, which people don't usually use for dogs. He said it looked like a human expression stretched across an animal's face, like the proportions of recognition and intent mapped onto something that should not have been capable of either. He said the moment he stepped toward the window, the moment it registered that he had noticed it, something shifted in the way it was standing. And then it was gone. He checked out the next morning, paid cash, didn't leave a contact name. Then there were the calls from people living closer to the hills. They didn't describe anything visual at all. What they reported was a sound. A long mechanical siren. That's the best word most of them found for it. A tone that carried across the tree line with no visible source. It wasn't tied to weather events. It wasn't connected to any emergency broadcast infrastructure in the area. Didn't repeat on any schedule that could be predicted or mapped. But every single person who mentioned it described the same thing happening immediately afterward. The woods went completely still. Not the kind of quiet that falls after a loud sound. Not startled silence. Something more deliberate than that. Like a switch had been thrown, and everything living in that corridor had simply stopped. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the branches. The kind of absolute silence that doesn't occur in nature without a cause. And a cause, whatever produced that sound, was never found. On their own, each of those reports could be explained away. A confused hiking group misidentifying an animal they hadn't seen before. A frightened motel guest letting his imagination run in a dark parking lot at 2 in the morning. Rural residents experiencing audio phenomena from distant industrial equipment or weather-related acoustic distortion. That's the easy path. But when I started cross-referencing the timelines, when I started mapping where each report originated relative to the service road and the missing man's last known location. The overlaps weren't coincidental. The tall, heavy presence in the trees, the dog with the wrong face, the mechanical siren, and the silence that followed. They were all clustering within the same 48-hour window, within the same 3-mile corridor, converging on the same point from different directions, leaving behind evidence that didn't belong to any single source. That's when I understood what I was actually dealing with. It wasn't one problem presenting itself in different ways. It was multiple things moving through the same area at the same time, crossing paths, stacking on top of each other, and leaving behind a tangle of evidence that looked like noise because no one was looking for more than one answer. I've seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize it. When a corridor gets active, when something about a location draws more than one kind of presence simultaneously, the confusion it creates is almost impossible to work through using standard methods. Because standard methods assume a single cause, and when you're dealing with multiple causes operating independently of each other in the same space, every explanation you find just makes the next piece of evidence look more wrong. You have to start from scratch. You have to stop trying to explain everything and start trying to survive everything. The river made it worse. Several reports had come in from people who had been out near the Hudson late at night, mostly along older docks and broken shoreline access points, the kind that haven't been actively maintained or used for decades, where the wood is gray and soft, and the water access signs have been half pulled by rust and weather. They described lights, drifting low over the water, moving slowly from the direction of New Jersey and crossing into New York without any visible aircraft structure. No sound, no navigation lights in the standard configuration, no signal strobes, just light, moving across the water with a slowness and deliberateness that ruled out conventional aircraft, and moving without the drift or instability that would suggest something natural, like marsh gas or atmospheric reflection. Some of the witnesses said the lights held position for extended periods, just stopped and stayed, hovering over a fixed point on the water for long enough that the people watching them had time to get their phones out, try to record, and watch the footage later with the creeping understanding that the lights had somehow not captured the way they looked in person. Others described the lights changing direction, all at once, without any transition, not banking like an aircraft, not drifting like a balloon, just immediately somewhere else, as if the space between where they were and where they ended up hadn't been traveled at all. No one could agree on the number. Some said 2, some said 6. Some said they'd stopped counting because the number kept changing. But every single person agreed on one thing. Something changed when those lights appeared. The temperature, the way sound traveled across the water, the feeling, and I know how that sounds, but every witness used a version of this same word. The feeling of being watched from a direction that had nothing to do with where the lights were, like the lights were the distraction. By the time I had worked through all of that, by the time I had spent enough nights in that corridor to understand what I was walking into, I stopped treating the assignment like a standard job. The evidence didn't support a single target. Trying to reduce everything to one explanation would have gotten me killed within the first 24 hours. I know that with certainty, not as speculation. I know it because I made that mistake in a different region years earlier, and the only reason I'm here is that I had the sense to reverse course before I got too far into the situation to pull back. So I adjusted. Instead of trying to understand everything at once, instead of trying to solve the whole picture, I started breaking the area down into smaller, survivable pieces. Patterns I could navigate, situations I could recognize in real time, when there wasn't enough space between perception and response for analysis. Not theories, not academic frameworks, not anything I needed to justify to someone sitting in an office 100 miles away. Just rules. Simple, direct, tied to specific situations that had already proven they could go wrong fast. Every one of those rules came from contact, not observation from a safe distance, not second-hand accounts from witnesses who survived, not guesswork assembled from reports I read before I arrived in the field. Contact. The kind that leaves marks, the kind that costs time, equipment, and in some cases, people who didn't make it back out of those woods, or off that shoreline, or away from one of those back roads after dark. I didn't write these rules down because they sounded good. I didn't write them because they gave the story a cleaner shape or made it easier to tell. I wrote them because I needed something I could follow when the situation stopped making sense and there wasn't time left to figure it out. Something I could access without thinking. Something that didn't require me to understand what was happening, only to recognize the pattern and know what to do. There are 5 rules that matter in that part of New York. 5 that apply to the river, the hills, and the stretches of land in between, where the geography makes it easy for things that don't normally share space to cross into the same corridor without warning. You won't find them in any official documentation. You won't hear them stated clearly by the locals either. Not because the locals don't know, but because the people who've had real contact in that region don't talk about it in ways that translate cleanly. They talk around it. They warn you without explaining the warning. They use phrases that sound like superstition until the moment you're standing in that field at 2 in the morning, and every single word they said comes into focus at once. By the time it makes sense, you might already be too far in to use it. If you're anywhere near that corridor, driving those back roads at night, staying in those motels along Route 9, walking past the point where the maintained trails end and the marked paths stop being maintained, you need to understand something before you understand anything else. This isn't one problem. It's several. But there are rules to survive each one. And the first one, the first rule, is the easiest to break without realizing you're already breaking it. Because it starts before you ever step off the road. It starts the moment you hear something. Rule 1. Never follow heavy footsteps into the trees. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Most survival advice sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Don't go toward the danger. Don't follow the thing you can't see. Don't let curiosity override self-preservation in an environment that's already shown you it's hostile. But this rule isn't about courage or curiosity or any simple failure of common sense. It's about something more specific than that, and more dangerous. It's about the way the sound works. When I say heavy footsteps, I'm not describing the sound of a large animal moving through underbrush. I've tracked bears, moose, and animals considerably less documented than either, and I know what size and weight sound like, moving through a forest at different speeds, on different ground, in different weather conditions. What I'm describing is something different. The footsteps come at a pace that doesn't match any natural gait you'd hear from wildlife in the region. Not too fast, not too slow, deliberate. Each impact fully placed before the next one begins. The spacing between each step is consistent in a way that suggests intention rather than movement through terrain. And the weight is wrong. Not wrong in the sense of impossible. Wrong in the sense of inconsistent with what you can see. When you hear this sound, near a section of woods with younger trees and lighter undergrowth, the weight implied by the sound doesn't match the environment that sound is coming from. It's too heavy for the space it's occupying, like the sound is being produced somewhere else and arriving at your location from a slightly different angle than the physical source. I know how that sounds. Stay with me. The first time I encountered this, properly encountered it, in a way that confirmed it wasn't an auditory anomaly or a trick of the terrain. I was on the eastern edge of the service road, about half a mile north of where the missing man's truck had been found. It was early evening, still enough light in the sky to see the tree line clearly, but deep enough into dusk that the space between the trees had gone dark. The sound started to my left. Slow, even, heavy enough that I could feel the faint vibration of it through the ground, which should not have been possible given the distance the sound appeared to be coming from. My first instinct, and I want to be honest about this because the instinct is important, my first instinct was to move toward it. Not out of recklessness, out of training. When you hear something large and you can't identify it, you don't stand still in an open area and wait for it to come to you. You move to get a sight line, you assess the threat, you make a decision based on what you can actually see. That instinct is correct in almost every situation I've been in. This was not one of those situations. What stopped me wasn't fear, or at least, it didn't feel like fear in the conventional sense. It was something more like the recognition that the sound was adjusting. Each time I shifted my weight, each time I changed my orientation even slightly, the footsteps shifted in response. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious if you weren't paying close attention, but just enough that after the third or fourth micro-adjustment, I was absolutely certain that what I was hearing was not moving independently of what I was doing. It was tracking me, not following me. I hadn't moved. Tracking me, orienting toward my position with each sound it produced, as if the footsteps themselves were a form of triangulation rather than locomotion. I stopped moving entirely. The sound continued for approximately 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited 4 minutes without moving. I've timed these situations often enough that I can hold position for measured intervals without a watch. Then, from a completely different direction, the sound started again. Not continuing from where it had left off, starting fresh. Same pace, same weight, same quality of impact, but from the opposite side of the road. The footsteps in this corridor are not one entity moving through the environment. That took me 3 separate encounters to understand fully, and I want to give you the benefit of that understanding now, rather than making you arrive at it the hard way. The sound is produced, or reproduced, at multiple points simultaneously, or in rapid sequence close enough to simultaneous that the distinction doesn't matter practically. It creates the impression of something approaching from one direction, while the actual point of threat, if there is a point of threat, which is not guaranteed, is positioned differently. The footsteps are not a location. They are a direction. And the direction they point you toward is not where the sound is coming from. People who follow the footsteps into the trees, and there are documented cases of this happening, spread across multiple incidents in that corridor over more than 20 years. They don't come back to the road at the same point they entered. The ones who come back at all come back confused about direction in a way that can't be fully explained by disorientation. They emerge from the trees at angles that don't correspond to how far they traveled or how long they were inside. Their internal compass has been interfered with in a way that persists for hours, sometimes longer. The ones who don't come back, the open cases, the unexplained disappearances filed under environmental accidents or voluntary departures, they followed the sound long enough to reach whatever the sound was designed to lead them toward. I don't know what that is. I won't claim I do. What I know is this. The footsteps move in a direction that feels inevitable. That's the right word, inevitable. Like the sound is creating a path that your body wants to follow before your mind has finished evaluating whether that's a good idea. Like some part of your nervous system has recognized a call and begun responding to it without your permission. That's the mechanism. That's what makes this rule the first one. Because by the time most people realize they've been following the sound, they've already crossed the edge of the tree line. And once you're inside that boundary at night, the rules for navigating back out are different than the rules for the open road. So, if you hear heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the tree line, especially in the stretch of woodland between the service roads and the river access points, you do not move toward them. You do not attempt to identify the source. You do not tell yourself it's a deer or a bear or someone else out there who might need help. You stay on the road. You put your back to something solid, and you wait for the sound to stop. It will stop. Everything in that corridor eventually moves on. Nothing there has infinite patience. The footsteps are not hunting you. They're testing you. They want to know if you'll follow. If you demonstrate that you won't, the sound resolves and the corridor returns to a state you can navigate. But if you move toward it, even once, the dynamic changes. And changing it back is not something I can give you a rule for. That's rule 1. The next 4 are harder. Not harder to follow, harder to survive learning. Because they come from the river, from the hills, from the places in that corridor where the geography creates conditions that amplify whatever is already operating there, and where the margin for error drops down to something I can barely measure. I'll tell you all of them. I'll tell you where they came from, and what it costs to learn them, and what you should do if you find yourself in a situation where they apply. But you need to understand something first. These rules don't make you safe. Nothing in that corridor makes you safe. Anyone who tells you there's a guaranteed way through that area without exposure is either lying to you or hasn't been there long enough to know what exposure feels like when it starts. What these rules do is buy you time. Time to get back to the road. Time to get in your vehicle. Time to put enough distance between yourself and that stretch of the Hudson Valley that whatever is operating in that corridor no longer has a line to you. That's the only goal. Not understanding, not documentation, not confrontation. Distance. Always distance. The second rule is about the water. Specifically, about what happens when you get too close to the river after the lights appear. The lights I described earlier, the ones that drift low over the Hudson, moving without sound from the New Jersey side. They are not the primary concern. I need to be clear about that, because most people who hear about the lights fixate on them as the thing to avoid, and in doing so they miss the actual threat. The lights are visible. Visible things in that environment are almost always secondary. What you need to be watching, what you need to be tracking when the lights appear, is the shoreline. Rule 2. Do not approach the shoreline when the air goes warm off the water at night. The Hudson River runs cold in that stretch, particularly after dark. That's a physical reality tied to the depth of the channel, the rate of flow, and the temperature differentials that develop between the river surface and the surrounding air as the season moves toward autumn. When the lights appear, and sometimes in the hour before they appear as a precursor, that temperature relationship inverts. The air coming off the water becomes warm. Not marginally warmer. Noticeably warmer. Warm enough that if you're standing 20 feet from the shore, you'll feel it as a clear change in ambient temperature, like walking from a cool room into a space that's been recently occupied by people, like body heat carried on air that shouldn't be carrying it. That warmth is not meteorological. I've had it measured. I've cross-referenced it against weather data, tidal patterns, and thermal imaging from equipment that doesn't make things up. The warmth does not correspond to any atmospheric or hydrological process that operates in that river under those conditions. It corresponds to the lights. Every documented appearance of the lights over the water, going back through reports that span more than 2 decades in that corridor, has been preceded or accompanied by this inversion. The warm air comes off the surface on a river that should be cold. And when it does, something is happening at the waterline. I've gotten close enough on 2 separate occasions to understand the outline of what's occurring there. I won't go into complete detail because doing so requires describing specific events in a way that I don't believe serves the purpose of this account. What I can tell you is that the activity at the shoreline is not consistent with the lights overhead. The lights and the shoreline activity are separate phenomena operating simultaneously. This is important. This is the core of Rule 2, because the lights draw attention upward, and everything at the waterline happens low, in the dark, below the horizon that most people are watching when the aerial display is active. If you're standing on one of those old docks, watching the lights over the river, you are not watching the right thing. And the distance between you and the waterline is shrinking without your awareness. 3 people in reported incidents over the years described the same specific sequence of events before contact at the shoreline. First, the warm air. Second, a sound from the water that they initially processed as normal river noise, current against the dock supports, or debris moving in the flow, or a fish disturbing the surface. Third, the understanding, arriving all at once and too late to be useful, that the sound was not coming from the water. It was coming from below the dock they were standing on. I'll leave the specifics of what came after at that. What I'll tell you is that none of those three people are willing to go near that stretch of river anymore. Not at night, not in daylight, not under any circumstances. And the two I was able to speak with at any length both described a loss of time following the third step that they've never been able to account for. Minutes in one case, in the other, considerably longer. Neither of them retained a complete account of what happened between step 3 and the moment they found themselves back on solid ground, away from the water, with no memory of having moved. That's the mechanism of Rule 2. The lights are designed to be watched. The warmth is the signal that something else is approaching from the water side. And by the time the sound arrives, by the time you've identified what you're actually hearing, the distance you need between yourself and the shoreline is already gone. If the air off the river turns warm at night, you walk away from the water. Not quickly. Not in a way that suggests panic or sudden movement. Steadily. With purpose but without urgency. Back toward the road. Back toward light sources. Back toward the kind of human infrastructure that creates noise and activity and doesn't leave you isolated in the dark, with your eyes pointed at the sky, while something you cannot see narrows the distance between you and itself. That's Rule 2. There are 3 more. The third one almost broke me. Not physically. I've been in situations that were physically worse. But cognitively. In the specific way that contact with something you can't categorize affects the part of your brain that needs to be working clearly in order to keep you alive. The third rule is about the dog. Rule 3. If an animal looks at you like it knows you, leave the area. Do not look back. The motel guest I mentioned earlier, the one who described the dog in the parking lot, was not the only person to report that kind of encounter in the corridor. He was just the most articulate about it. There are at least 7 similar accounts in the cluster of reports from that region, spread across different locations, different times of year, different animals. Not always dogs. In 2 cases, the animal described was a deer. In one case, a fox. In one case, and this is the one that took me longest to accept as a coherent report rather than an embellished account, a bird. A crow perched on a fence post at the edge of a field, watching a woman walk to her car every morning for 3 days in a row. On the 4th morning, it was gone. On the 5th morning, she saw it again. Inside her house. She didn't have any windows open. She couldn't explain how it got in. And when she called someone to help her remove it, it was gone again by the time they arrived. She moved out of that property within the month. The specific quality that connects all of these encounters, the thing that every witness describes in a different way, but is clearly reporting the same experience, is the quality of the attention. Animals pay attention to humans all the time. That's not unusual. What's unusual is the quality of attention that appears in these encounters, a fixation that doesn't behave like animal awareness. Animal awareness is reactive. It checks you, registers you as a variable in the environment, and then either remains alert or dismisses you and returns to its primary behavior. It's fundamentally about assessing risk. What people are describing in these encounters is not risk assessment. It's recognition. The animal, whatever body the attention is arriving in, looks at the person in a way that conveys individual identification. Not, there is a human in this space, but you are in this space. The specific you. The person standing there, who that thing has been looking for, or wait for, or has encountered before, in a context the person themselves cannot remember. That's what the motel guest was trying to describe when he said the expression looked human. He wasn't saying the face looked human. He was saying the content of the expression, the intent behind it, was operating on a level of individuation that animal cognition shouldn't be capable of. Why does this require a rule? Because the natural human response to that kind of direct, sustained attention from an animal is engagement. We're wired to respond to being recognized, to return a gaze, to attempt communication, even across species, even in a situation that our rational minds are simultaneously flagging as wrong. The social instinct is older than the reasoning instinct, and in a moment of genuine confusion, the social instinct tends to win. And engagement, sustained eye contact, movement toward the animal, any form of reciprocal response, is what extends the encounter past the point where leaving is still a clean option. I don't fully understand the mechanism. I've spent enough time with this to have theories, but I won't give you theories when the practical rule is more useful. What I can tell you is what I've observed, and what I've pieced together from every account in that corridor where someone engaged versus every account where someone broke contact and left. The people who engaged, who held the gaze, who moved closer, who spoke to the animal, who tried to interact with whatever was operating behind that attention, they reported escalating experiences following the encounter, events that followed them home, events that seemed to target them specifically in their specific locations after they'd left the corridor. The people who broke contact and left, who turned away, who got in their cars, who removed themselves from the situation without attempting to understand it. Those people reported the encounters as isolated, disturbing, certainly, memorable in the way that genuinely anomalous experiences are always memorable, but not persistent, not following. The rule is simple. If an animal looks at you in a way that feels like recognition, leave. Don't run. Don't shout. Don't make a scene that draws attention and disrupts your own ability to move calmly. Just leave. Turn away from the animal, not abruptly, not in a way that could be read as aggression or alarm, and walk toward your vehicle. Eyes forward. Move in with the same steadiness I described for the water rule. Do not look back. I know that's the hardest part. The instinct to confirm, to check over your shoulder and verify that nothing is following, is almost irresistible. Do not look back. Every account I have from someone who broke the rule and looked back, not a single one of them can fully describe what they saw. Not because they're withholding, because the visual processing associated with that moment didn't complete in the way that normal seeing completes. They saw something. They just can't make it into words that stay consistent. Don't look back. Leave the area, get distance, and don't return to that location within the same 24-hour window. After that, After enough time has passed, the attention has moved on to something else. Or it's finished with you. Either way, you don't want to be there for the determination. That's Rule 3. There are 2 more. The 4th one saved my life directly. Not in a way I could prove to anyone, not in a way that fits into an incident report or a liability filing or any document that uses standard categories for what happened, but in a way I am absolutely certain about. Rule 4. If the silence starts, you have 90 seconds to reach cover. I've described the silence before, the absolute stillness that descends on the corridor after the mechanical sound, after the tone that carries across the tree line without a source. But the silence also comes without the sound. That's what I didn't understand at first, that the sound is one trigger for the silence, but not the only one. The silence is a condition. It's the environment responding to a presence that operates on a threshold above what the rest of the natural world is willing to share space with. When something of sufficient magnitude, I'll call it, enters the corridor, the surrounding biology shuts down, not in a panicked way, not in a frightened way, in a deliberate way, like a system going into protective mode. Every bird, every insect, every mammal in the underbrush, all at once. If you've ever been in a forest at night and experienced that, if you've ever had the soundscape of the natural world just stop simultaneously, without a gradual fade or an obvious cause, then you already know what I'm describing, and some part of you already knows that you should have moved when it happened. The silence is not the threat. The silence is the warning. And the window between the warning and the arrival of whatever triggered it is approximately 90 seconds. I've timed this across 4 separate incidents. It's not exact. Nothing in that corridor operates on exact schedules. But 90 seconds is the consistent margin. In 2 cases, it was slightly shorter. In 1 case, it extended to almost 2 minutes. In no documented case, I have access to did the interval exceed 2 minutes. 90 seconds. Cover means different things depending on where you are in the corridor. If you're near the service road, a vehicle is cover. Get inside. Close the door. Do not open it until the ambient sound of the natural world returns. If you're on the shoreline, any structure with walls and a roof is preferable to open ground. But the critical factor is not the walls. It's being off the shoreline. Get to solid ground away from the water. Get above the lower level of the riverbank. If you're in the hills, this is the most complex situation, and the one with the least reliable cover options. I'll address it specifically in the context of the 5th rule. The key principle: you are removing yourself from open exposure. What comes during that silence, what arrives in the 90 seconds following the environmental shutdown, does not appear to be interested in spaces it has to enter deliberately. Open ground, open water, open sky. Those are where it operates. Enclosed spaces create a threshold it either won't or doesn't cross. I don't know why. I have theories tied to how it navigates, what senses it uses, what the structure of a wall or a roof represents in terms it can process. I don't know. What I know is that in every incident where someone was in an enclosed space when the silence fell and the 90-second window passed, they reported the presence moving around the exterior of the space and then leaving, without entry. Every incident where someone remained in open ground when the window closed, those are the incidents that don't have complete accounts, because the people who would give you the complete account aren't available to give it. 90 seconds. If the silence starts, you move. Not in a panic, not randomly, toward the nearest enclosed space with purpose and speed. And you stay there until the birds come back. When the birds come back, when the natural sound of that environment resumes, the window has closed, and whatever moved through has continued on. You wait for the birds. You don't decide for yourself that enough time has passed. You wait for the birds. That's rule 4. One more. The 5th rule is the one that takes the longest to explain, not because it's complicated, but because understanding why it matters requires understanding something about the geography of the corridor itself that I haven't fully addressed yet. The hills. Rule 5. Do not cross into the hills after midnight unless you were already inside them at sundown. The Hudson Valley's western hills, the ridge lines that rise above the river towns and back away from the water into the interior, are not uniform in terms of what operates there. Most of the elevated terrain in that region is, for practical purposes, safe during daylight hours. Normal wilderness navigation rules apply. The hazards are the standard hazards of remote terrain: weather, physical injury, disorientation from poor trail markers. At night, those hills become different territory. Not all of them. Not uniformly. There are specific sections, running roughly from the northern edge of a particular unincorporated stretch south to within 2 miles of a larger river town, where the conditions after midnight are categorically different from the conditions before it. This is not metaphorical. This is a specific behavioral distinction that I've documented through direct experience and cross-referenced against accounts from the small number of people who've spent significant time in those hills after dark. The hills are layered. What I mean by that, and this is the hardest part of this entire account to translate into language that doesn't make me sound like I've lost my professional credibility, is that the space inside those hills at night contains overlapping territories that belong to different things. Things that coexist without interacting. Things that maintain their respective domains without conflict, because the geography itself seems to create natural divisions that they operate within rather than across. During the day, those divisions are observable but not binding. You can move through the hills without crossing into a space that's being used by something that considers itself to occupy it. Pause. After midnight, the divisions become active. The territories are occupied. The inhabitants, for lack of a better word, are operating within them. And the experience of crossing from one zone into another after midnight, from outside the hills, is the experience of entering an already active space as an uninvited variable. I've done it once. Accidentally, I'd lost track of time in a way I still can't fully explain, which I suspect was itself a symptom of proximity to something in the lower terrain. I won't describe what happened in complete detail. I'll tell you that the disorientation was total, that my navigation equipment stopped functioning in a way that left no physical evidence of malfunction when I had it checked afterward, and that I spent 3 hours covering ground that should have taken me 20 minutes. When I emerged, when I finally found the edge of the elevated terrain and worked my way back down to the service road, I was 1.5 miles from where I should have come out. And I had one memory from those 3 hours that I couldn't account for. A clearing, lit from no visible source, with something at the center that I had registered clearly enough to remember that I'd seen it, but not clearly enough to reconstruct what it actually was. Just the shape. And the certainty, the absolute certainty, that whatever it was had registered me as well. That I had been seen. The rule exists because of that experience, and because of others like it in that region. If you are inside the hills at sundown, if you were already there, already established in that terrain before the territories activated, you are a known variable in a known space. The things that operate there are aware of you, and they make their calculations accordingly. It isn't safe, exactly, but it's navigable. If you enter the hills after midnight, if you cross from the road into the elevated terrain after the territories have gone active, you arrive as something unknown in a space that is already occupied and already arranged. And being unknown in that context is not neutral. It is a problem. For everything in those hills that has arranged itself around an understanding of what belongs in the space and what doesn't, your arrival is a disruption. And disruptions in that environment have consequences that are difficult to predict and nearly impossible to control once they've started. Don't enter the hills after midnight unless you were already inside them at sundown. If you find yourself at the tree line of that elevated terrain after midnight, and you feel the pull toward it, and some people describe feeling exactly that, a pull, like the terrain itself is drawing them toward it in a way they can't articulate, stop. Put your back to it. Walk toward the road. The pull is not an invitation. It is the space recognizing that you are about to cross a threshold you are not equipped to cross. And the geometry of it is such that the closer you get to the edge, the more the pull intensifies. It is not welcoming you. It is registering you as something that is approaching, and the registration itself creates a field that your nervous system interprets as attraction. You are not being invited. You are being detected. Turn around. Walk to the road. Get in your car. Drive south until the hills are behind you and the river towns are in your mirrors. And then keep driving for at least another 20 minutes. Not because you're still in danger. Because you need the distance in your body before you need it in your mind. Those are the 5 rules. I want to be clear about something before I close this account. I'm not telling you this story to make that region sound like a place you should avoid completely. I'm not telling it to build mythology or to sensationalize experiences that are better understood through the framework of genuine fieldwork. I'm telling it because I spent a long time learning these rules at a cost I wouldn't ask anyone else to pay. And because the Hudson Valley Corridor, that specific stretch between the hills and the river, is still active, still drawing attention, still producing the conditions that I've described here. And the people who end up in that corridor aren't usually looking for what they find there. They're driving through. They're staying over. They're hiking on trails that look maintained and then aren't. They're stopping their cars because something sounds wrong, and then getting out instead of driving on. If you take nothing else from this account, take the direction I pointed you in repeatedly throughout it. Get back to the road. Get back in your vehicle. Create distance. That's not a spiritual instruction or a piece of mystical advice dressed up in practical language. It's what has worked every time something hasn't worked. Every rule I've given you comes down to that same core. reduce exposure, increase distance, and don't let whatever is operating in that corridor get close enough to change the way you understand what's happening around you. Because once your understanding has been altered, once the contact has gone on long enough to reshape how your brain is processing the environment, getting to the road isn't enough anymore. And I don't have a rule for that. Nobody does.